Thanks, Robin. And it's good to be with you this morning. Last few weeks, I was not preaching, and we actually scheduled to not be away, but just to have some time for some long-range planning and, the time that usually takes to prep the sermon. We were working on the 5-year plan and all that. And so all that to say, it didn't really work out the way I had hoped and had planned. The last few weeks have been really heavy in our home. It was 2 weeks ago on Sunday, I preached. Monday, I'm off. I'm always off on Mondays. We're kind of resting. And that evening, usually that's when I kind of get ready to go back to work Tuesday morning. And there was, let's just put it this way, there was a little accident in our home, and I got to fulfill a childhood dream to ride in an ambulance, okay? Now, it wasn't in the passenger seat, and we'll just leave the story there because it's such a great sermon analogy, I don't want to waste it just telling you. So in the coming weeks, months, or years, I'll share it with you then, okay? And it's going to be a great sermon analogy, but it's a little bit embarrassing, so we probably won't put it on the internet. So if you want to make sure you never miss that story, just never miss a week of church. You're welcome. And I promise to use it the next few weeks, months, or years, okay? Anyway, so it took me about a whole week to recover. Ended up working from home the rest of the week and was able to finally leave the house and get here. I was able to host last weekend. And then last week at the end, kind of Monday, rest again, getting ready for the week. And then, Monday night, many of you probably received the same news. News broke of a pastor in Southern Ontario that had been guilty of sexual abuse and abuse of power, and it had been hidden for decades. This is a pastor that I knew and loved and had learned so much from. And so it was an incredibly heavy night and rest of the week in our home, and thousands of people who were just grieving or feeling lost. There were pastors who had been mentored and had grown so much to this person who were now just kind of discombobulated, to be honest, right? There were victims of religious abuse or sexual abuse who were triggered and re-triggered. And so it was just a heavy few weeks leading out of that. And as I kind of got ready to get back into preaching and I was kind of thinking about where we are in our series, I asked this question, I'm like, do I talk about it? Do I not? And that's something as pastors we're constantly wrestling with, right? It's like, what do we mention? What do we not? What is, pastoral moments in an office, one-on-one, and what are things we need to speak to our entire church about? And so I was kind of wrestling back and forth about speaking to this issue or not. And then I opened up the book of Luke to see the next part that we're touching on. And Luke chapter 11, it's Jesus putting the religious leaders on blast. And he exposes their personal religious hypocrisy, and he will not let them keep it in the dark. And I thought, okay, Jesus, I guess we're going there. And so if you're not a church person, not a Christian, here's the neat thing about today. You already probably think religious people are hypocrites. And today you kind of realize Jesus and you have that in common. He seemed to have a similar thought. For those of you in the room who have, roles of religious leadership, whether it's in a nonprofit organization, you're a pastor, we have some pastors who watch online, some retired pastors who actually attend here, right? This message is for me and for you. And yet if you're a commoner, a non-religious leader, just an average Jesus follower, you're like, this is great. I have a nap that I really need to take right now, and this is perfect. You just keep going, Mark, and you just make sure you're taking notes because this message is for you, Mark, but it's not for us. I want to tell you that today is just as much for you it is for me. If you follow Jesus, if you call yourself a Jesus follower, and if you are continually heartbroken when you see headlines of people who've been entrusted with leading people to Jesus, who've used their power and title to hurt others. If you're grieved by that, today is for you and today is for me. If you refuse to accept the status quo, I'm excited for today. If you want to turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 11, verse 37, whether you're at home or here in the room, I always love for you to follow, in your actual Bible. You can circle, highlight, underline, take notes. But if not, if you don't have a Bible with you, it's going to all be on the screen. Fun fact about this passage, totally unrelated to all the things I just shared. This is the first sermon I ever preached in my entire life was this passage. I was 16 years old, and my youth pastor said, hey, Mark, you're going to preach next month. Here's your passage. And that was the baptism by fire. I was 16 at the time. That was a few decades ago. If you're online and in the chat, want to have some fun, I'll give you a clue. It was more than 1 decade ago and less than 4. You can go ahead and try and guess my age. Don't be mean. Ready to go? Here we go. Luke 11:37. When Jesus had finished speaking, a Pharisee, I'll explain that in a second, a Pharisee invited him to eat with him. So Jesus went in and reclined at the table. That's how you ate back then in Middle Eastern culture. You lay on the floor, you ate on the floor, you reclined. It was a very intimate setting. So Jesus has this Pharisee who invites him in. What's a Pharisee? A Pharisee, or the Pharisees, were a religious group of people. They had strict observance of the law and religious tradition. And they were so strict, they were so rule focused that they didn't want people to break the rules. They were awesome. Some of you are like, I grew up in a home like this. There wasn't just the rule. There was then the rules they added to the rules. It was like another guardrail. So if you happened to break through that guardrail, you still hadn't broke the actual rule. So one of the classic ones was Sabbath. You shouldn't work on the Sabbath. So that's the guardrail. So the Pharisees come along and they start putting all these rules in. It's like, walking can get tiring. That can be work. So you're only allowed to take this many steps and then it becomes work. It's like they were adding rules to the rules. They were literally if you ever want to say these people are literally the religious police, the Pharisees were the religious police, okay? So they invite Jesus for dinner. Jesus goes and has dinner at their house. But the Pharisee, verse 38, but the Pharisee was surprised when he noticed that Jesus did not first wash before the meal, okay? Now this is interesting because if you know religious tradition, this was one of their rules before the rules. There was no actual rule that you had to wash before you ate, but there were rules about ceremonial uncleanliness, and they were so strict and they believed so much so that if something was unclean and then you touched it, then your cup touched your mouth, then it went into your body and it touched, it's like, gosh, they were like the COVID police before COVID was even a thing, right? They were so aware of it, and so they had this ceremonial washing that they would do before a meal. You see it in scripture, it's described, but it's not prescribed. There are stories of it happening. There are times when Jesus does it, but it's never mandated that you have to do it. But the religious leaders, the Pharisees, they mandated it. And so Jesus goes to their house for dinner, and today it's like he just decides for whatever reason, he's not gonna wash his hands, which would have been noticed because either the servant would have walked over with the water to offer or the host would have offered. And so that's why it says the host was surprised. We don't know how they were surprised. Did they raise an eyebrow? Did they kind of double take? Did they, hey, no, you sure you don't want some? We don't know. All we know is the host is surprised, and it's noticeable enough for the account to get back to Luke, and he puts it in there, that the host was surprised that Jesus didn't wash his hands. And the surprise is enough for Jesus to start. And boy, does he ever start. And I imagine people going home that night after watching the encounter that we're about to watch, and they're kind of summarizing it, their families. It's like, what happened? I just think they're gonna summarize it with 3 words. Jesus lost it. Jesus lost it. And that's not actually what happened, but that's maybe what it would feel like to the people that were there. Jesus is gonna speak strongly, forcefully, and with conviction. Here's what I want you to take note of. Who is Jesus speaking to in the following verses? Religious people who have been abusing their power. Jesus is not speaking strongly and with conviction against unreligious people who don't believe in him. Let's continue the story. This is Jesus, and he starts, and he doesn't come down for a while. Here it is, verse 39. Then the Lord said to him, now then, this is all in response to whatever reaction this religious ruler, the Pharisee, acted surprised. Now then, the Lord said, now then, you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and dish, which is exactly what they did. They're always cleaning things, always making things look good. But inside, this is where Jesus starts. You're full of greed and wickedness. Nice of you to stop by, Jesus. There's the door. Right? It's like, are we really going there? Jesus starts the engine and he is not coming down. And he is about to systematically dismantle the religious establishment with his words. And it is epic. Right out of the gate, he's saying, you are so meticulous for your man-made rules about cleaning inanimate objects, but your hearts are full of greed and wickedness. You are all about optics. You care more about looking good than being good. Any non-Christians in the room, you're like, am I allowed to say amen to that? Right? It's just that is just so real. And he's calling it out. He says this in verse 40, you foolish people, speaking to the religious elite, did not the one who made the outside, speaking of God, did not the one who made the outside, your external life, make the inside also your interior world? Jesus is saying, how dare you divide your internal life and your external life? God made both. You might describe this as compartmentalization. The life that you live on the outside does not reflect. It's a front. It's a mask put on to cover up what's really happening inside of you. And we know this is a problem, right? 2,000 years later, and this isn't just a religious leader problem. You see this in politics. Just watch the news. The military, in business, and if we're gut level honest, and common people like you and me. It's a people trait to live compartmentalized. And Jesus is saying right up front, to live this way is to dishonor God who created both. You don't even have to be religious to feel the impact of compartmentalization. Maybe you had this in your home. There was a family member, a parent, a guardian who was continuously putting on a front outside, and people say, oh, your parents are so great, or this person's so great, your uncle's so great. And you're like, you don't see them at home. You don't know what they're really like. You maybe had this at work. You had a boss who was always for you, always encouraging you, except at the boardroom table. Then they were always using you to make themselves look better. It was compartmentalized. There was something inside that when it came to outside, it looked different. This happens, we're gonna talk about this a few times today, social media. Some of you see things posted online, you're like, that's not what's really going on in their life. They're not really doing that well, right? Like there's something in human nature that is constantly compartmentalizing, putting on a front, cleaning the outside, while the inside is rotten. All of us, if we're honest, struggle with this at some level. And then Jesus, kind of oddly it seems, gives a solution that kind of seems out of left field, but just take note of it. We'll circle back to it. Verse 41, but now as for what is inside of you. So he's just called it out, right? He's like, this isn't good. He's like, you're rotten, you're greedy on the inside. He says, now as for you, what is inside of you? Be generous to the poor and everything will be clean for you. That feels oversimplistic. Be generous to the poor and everything will be clean for you. Somehow caring for the poor will make us all better. It seems oversimplistic. And after the next verse, I'll show you how that ties in, okay? I'll make it make sense, but just hang tight. The next part and the rest of this passage, Jesus decides to break down systematically all the ways in which these religious leaders, and we're gonna see ourselves reflected in this, even if we don't have a title of religious authority in any way, he's gonna break down all the ways in which religious people lived compartmentalized and hypocritical lives. Honestly, this could be 5 different messages. So here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna talk fast. Don't try and catch everything and write a note for everything, because after each section, I'm gonna give us probably 3 or 4 different times to just pause and invite the Spirit to speak to us, what God is trying to say in that moment to us specifically. Take note of that, and then we'll move on, okay? And so each part, when Jesus is about to call out some hypocrisy, he starts with, whoa. Okay, so when you're going through it, you just highlight all the woes. There's a bunch of them, okay? So he starts off verse 42, he says this, woe to you Pharisees, you religious leaders, because you give God 1/10 of your mint, rue, and all other kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. Okay, what's happening here? So a tithe or 1/10 of income was something that the Jewish people would always give. They'd give it to the temple. It was for the nation, for the temple, for the priests, Levites, for taking care of the clergy. They always gave a tithe of everything they had, and they would do that. And these religious leaders were so specific. Remember, they're the rules of the rules of the rules. So they wouldn't just be like, of your income. It's like they'd go into the cupboards and count out 10% of every spice they had. Right? Talk about religious legalism. It's like, oh, and did you get the curry powder? And you got the garlic powder. And you got the, right? Like they would just go through it all, make sure. They were so, and Jesus is like, you're going so detailed on all this stuff. And he's like, but you've neglected justice and the love of God. He's like, you're so focused on curry powder, but you forgot justice, love for the poor, and the marginalized, which is the heart of God. He says this, the love of God. Justice is God's heart. Remember a book written by, I gotta quote this right, Richard Stern. Last time I quoted it, I said Howard Stern. Internet blew up with that one. Richard Stern wrote this epic book called The Hole in Our Gospel. I read it years ago. He used to be the president of World Vision. And he had, someone who worked for him or a student, I can't remember the details, go through the Bible and literally cut out every single verse that talked about justice and caring for the marginalized. And he would take this with him when he spoke, and this didn't even look like a book anymore. It couldn't hold it up. It would just disintegrate. Because when you take out justice and care for the poor and love for neighbor and taking care of refugees, the scriptures don't even hold together. Justice is God's heart. And this is what he continues to say. He says, you should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. He doesn't say, forget about tithing your spices. He's like, that's awesome. You want to do that? More power to you. He's like, but don't you dare forget about the marginalized and the poor. Bring me all the gifts you want, but do not neglect justice. Now, I want to pause here for a second. Remember, I promised you I'd circle back to how caring for the poor leads to your heart becoming clean, helps us with hypocrisy. Here's the cool thing I've just learned in life experience. If you hang out with people who are really engaged in justice work, you realize very quickly they're so engaged with caring for the marginalized that these smaller issues often move to the periphery. They're so busy caring for the poor, they're not arguing about spice divisions and things that might fall into that category. And you see this all throughout church history. If you want to see unity in the church, because churches are really good about disunity and arguing and leaving and starting new churches. You want to see unity in the church where people aren't arguing about periphery things, spice amounts and all the things you'd put in that category. Look at the church in war zones. Talk to people who were, as I have, who were, missionaries or pastors stuck behind the Iron Curtain. You will find incredible unity amongst the churches and amongst church people because they're not arguing about insignificant things. You know why? They're too busy caring for the poor, the marginalized, fighting injustice. They're too focused on God's heart. For us religious folk in North America, it's easy to argue about insignificant things, and it's easy to be unaware of the incredible pain in the world that God's heart breaks for. As North Americans, we actually have to work hard and put in effort to make ourselves aware of the things that are going on in the world that breaks God's heart. Our algorithms will make sure that we are aware of the latest Kim Kanye drama, but not about the family I heard about this week that's been stuck in a refugee camp for 26 years. Or the person I got to have a walk with a few weeks ago who's part of our online community, who was born under a bridge in the middle of a civil war as bombs dropped all around them. Here's how I would summarize, I think, what Jesus is getting at. There's something about people whose attention is on the marginalized that seems to make it easier for them to not fall into religious hypocrisy and legalism. It's not foolproof, it's not guaranteed, but there is something about the gravitational pull when you're focused on the margins that makes it harder to be involved in legalism. Jesus said, be generous to the poor and everything will be clean for you. So let's just pause here and reflect for a second. Is there anything in your life that you're actively doing or involved in that leads you to be engaged in justice and compassion work in the world? And maybe that's an opportunity for your small groups to be following certain issues in the world, to be engaged and involved in bringing transformation and doing the work that is on God's heart. So just take a moment and just be still and see if God's bringing anything to mind, or maybe you just need to take a note of that to do that later. Just take a moment. Here's the next woe, verse 43. Woe to you Pharisees, Jesus continues, because you love the most important seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces. Okay, things change over time. There are different religious traditions and different ways that different cultures make their clergy feel big. The last time I ran into one of you at Home Depot, nobody bowed and called me reverend and kissed the ring. It doesn't really happen here. Nobody ever offers me the better seat at different events. But every culture, including ours, has ways of putting, their religious leaders on a pedestal and making them feel good. When I think about my own life, there are ways that I and other pastors, when we get together, we encourage each other and we challenge each other not to get sucked in by this potential. It's still a very real temptation today, even though it looks different than what it was for those modern religious people of those days. It looks different. But the reality is I will be held accountable. I will stand before God one day, and I feel the weight of that responsibility. Now, it's easy for the rest of us to be like, well, we're not religious leaders. We don't get greeted and called all these nice things and given the best seats. But I want to suggest to you that, throughout history, religious leaders historically have had massive influence. They, have had big platforms. I literally stand on a platform every week, okay? I get that. But before we just then say that's for religious people and don't actually pause and introspect, can I just suggest that maybe many of us actually have very large platforms as well and are just as likely to fall into this temptation just the same. There's this old quote from N.T. Wright, and it's kind of dated, but the point is so strong. So I just want to, maybe say that newspapers and journalists, you can actually add the term social media there as well. And I want to read it for you, see if it, strikes you a little bit. This is what N.T. Wright says. The Pharisees today, he's making it modern, might look a lot more like newspapers or journalists, or we'll add social media, who take it upon themselves to be the guardians of public morality. They shriek at offenses and delight in pointing the finger. Yet they are not examples of moral virtue. They are often the ones who load heavy burdens on people's back, but don't lift a finger to move them. How many of us, myself included, have ever posted about an issue that we've never dedicated an hour or $1 to that cause? We've never lifted a finger. If so, you and I are in the same category, where we are tempted to say or do or post the right thing to receive praise, and yet internally, nothing has changed. What if the modern day respectful greetings in the marketplace that Jesus challenges the religious leaders on, the modern day equivalent is likes, retweets, and reposts? So let's pause again and reflect. Are there times that we say or do or even post things or talk about things at dinner parties because it's the right thing to do and say, that it will look good or maybe it'll get reposted, but it hasn't actually impacted our internal life? It doesn't actually reflect our actions. Let's just be still with that for a sec. Ready for the next woe? Woe to you, because you're like unmarked graves which people walk over without knowing it. There's an odd, phrase. Imagine on the playground. Yeah, your mama so this. Oh yeah? You're an unmarked grave. It's like, what? How do you even respond to that? Like, what does that mean? And that's where 2,000 years of history kind of make things, not understandable. What does that mean? In the Old Testament law, remember the hyper-focus on cleanliness? Contact with a grave and with a dead body made a person unclean. So if there was a grave that had no marking, it was dangerous. You could be out walking, enjoying the beautiful weather, walking through a field, having a picnic. Someone come along and be like, you're sitting on top of a grave right now. And it's just like all of a sudden, you're unclean. You're ceremonially unclean. This is a big deal for them. And so unmarked graves, that's a dangerous thing for a religious person. And Jesus says to the religious leaders, you think you're giving people life. You're actually a bunch of unmarked graves. You're actually bringing death in disguise. You're full of rot and corruption. Here's how I would summarize this one. It is possible to follow a religious leader and be led away from God. Some of you are like, duh. Here's how I would summarize it. It's an uncomfortable situation, if I'm honest, where Jesus is calling out professional religious people. They look religious. You just Google Pharisee. They had full outfits they wore. Everyone knew there's the religious guy. They looked religious. They carried religious texts. They had it sewed into their clothing. They spent all their time reading the scriptures, talking about the scriptures, teaching the scriptures, enforcing the rules, because they would say, this is the way of life. And Jesus says, you guys lead to death. It's like, that's just turning the knife a little bit. So here's the question. How do you avoid following a religious leader who looks spiritual and yet leads to death? And that includes pastors like me. Can we just pause and just think of the irony where I'm answering a question that kind of says, how the pastor's going to tell us how to know if your pastor is leading you astray and how to know that I'm not leading you astray? That's kind of ironic. So here's what we'll do with this one, okay? I'll offer a suggestion, and you can fact check me on Google and see if I'm misleading you or not, okay? Google will always give you the right answer, I promise. Here's my suggestion about how not to be led to death by a religious leader, including myself. What's the opposite of death? Guys, this is an easy one. Come on. What's the opposite of death? Life. Guys, you don't even need Google. You're good, okay? What does Jesus say? I'm the way, the truth, and the life. You got it. Jesus is the embodiment of life. Let me summarize it this way. The way of life will always look like Jesus. You have grounds to question anything and anyone that doesn't look like Jesus. I'm not talking about a male with a beard who looks Middle Eastern. I'm talking about the ethos of Jesus. Anything I or another person brings to you, anything that we teach and embody and any behavior that we exhibit should look like Jesus. Now, I'm not saying this is bulletproof, but it sure would cut a lot of toxic religious leaders off at the pass. We may have degrees and be able to read Greek and be really convincing and speak eloquently, but do we carry ourselves like Jesus? Loving, gentle, patient, kind, gracious, peace-filled, not fighting for power, but fighting for opportunities to serve. That's Jesus. Now, I'm not saying if you see those things, then you can just don't even worry about it. They're definitely Jesus-y. I'm not saying that. Jesus is literally calling out religious leaders who look good on the outside. The inside is a mess. But what we can say is if it doesn't look like Jesus on the outside, then it definitely tells us what's going on the inside. So again, I'll leave that to you, but let me just remind you, the way of Jesus will always look like Jesus, will always feel like Jesus, will always sound like Jesus. We're at the halfway point. A few more woes to the religious leaders and more fun coming. One of the experts of the law, so someone speaks up now. Jesus is like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And someone's like, whoa, hang on a second. One of the experts of the law answered him, teacher, when you say these things, you insult us also. So there's the Pharisees, there's the experts of the law, these other religious group, right? And it's like, hey, Jesus, when you're calling out hypocrisy, when you're calling out false teaching, you're offending us as well. It's like, talk about self-incriminating. Jesus is calling out people who are doing bad things. And it's like, hey, Jesus, I think you're speaking about us as well. Now listen, they weren't stupid. This wasn't somebody who wasn't thinking and just self-incriminated themselves. When they say this, that you're insulting us, it's a power move. Jesus, you better watch your mouth. You think you're calling out one group. There's a lot of powerful people who are going to be upset by the rhetoric that you're spewing right now. Watch it. 2,000 years later, we still see this, don't we? In the church world, in politics, in the corporate world, someone tries to call out injustice or abuse of power, and it goes nowhere. Why? Because the whole system is infected, and the whole system won't budge. To which Jesus doesn't respond and say, shoot, man, I'm sorry. I didn't realize how prevalent this issue was. Didn't realize how many people I was going after. I'll back down. No, Jesus doesn't say that. Instead, oh, don't worry, friend. I'm just getting started. You want to talk about your issues? I got a few more woes for you. And then he goes into it. Verse 46, Jesus replied, you experts in the law, woe to you. You load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them. And this is the thing that was known. This actually happened in Matthew 23. You can read it, where Jesus actually calls out the religious, the law keepers. He's like, you put rules on other people that you won't even follow yourself. Some of you have experienced this. You've had religious leaders who are enforcing things on you that they don't even apply to themselves and their families and those in power with them. Jesus is saying Jesus is not saying in this moment that religious people shouldn't call people to a higher standard. He's calling out the religious hypocrites who want standards for everyone else, but not themselves. Jesus is saying to those people, you're a bunch of religious dictators. You know, it's a fun fact. If you read the Bible and all the ways that pastors and church leaders and just regular everyday Jesus followers, there's lots of word pictures that are described as to how we should, ascribe to be. Dictator is never one of them. I know it's surprising. Not once. You know what word comes up a lot? We are called to be shepherds. You ever hung out with a shepherd? Me neither. But here's what I hear. They stink. Not like they suck, like they literally stink. Why? Because they don't stand up on a rock and yell out to the fields, you dumb sheep, stop it, come on. They are in there, in the mud, in the dangerous place, literally sometimes carrying their sheep to safety, making sure they get to water. They are personally relating to each and every sheep that is under their care. That's the term that's used to describe Jesus followers, not dictators, but shepherds. As Jesus people, we are called to carry burdens with people. And often, and I'll go back to social media because I think it's one relevant for the times, it's easy to talk about what's right and wrong and who's doing right and wrong, and yet we never shepherd. We never actually get in the mess. Never journey with people and carry the weight of life change with them. And Jesus calls these religious leaders out. He's like, you won't even lift a finger. And I find it ironic, 2,000 years later, it's like, we'll lift a finger. We'll send a text or an email or post something on social, but that's as far as we will go. We will not get into the mess and carry people's burdens with them. And Jesus is calling that out. Shepherds had relationship with every sheep, and they journeyed with them through life. I wonder if there are ways in which we've been calling things out, but not actually in the trenches, journeying with people out of the darkness into the light. Verse 47, and we're getting close to the end now. Woe to you, because you build tombs for the prophets, and it was your ancestors who killed them. What's this mean? What are prophets? Okay, quick Israel history. God would constantly send prophets to the people who were to speak on behalf of God. And they would remind them, hey, guys, don't go that way, go this way, God's saying this. And people would classically make fun of the prophets, beat up the prophets. There's one prophet that gets thrown in a well. And there were times where prophets were killed. It's like, we don't like the message that you're spewing, even though it was a message from God, and they would kill them. And so the religious leaders of the day, they'd look back and say, oh my gosh, I can't believe what our ancestors did. Hindsight's 2020. They were so dumb. How could they not listen to God's messengers? We're so much better now. This is what Jesus says to that. You testify that you approve of what your ancestors did. They killed the prophets and you build their tombs. I love the way one author summarized it. He's like, your ancestors killed the prophets and you make sure they stay dead. And then he continues on in verse 49, and he continues with this theme. I'm just going to read it for you quickly. Because of this, God in his wisdom said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and others they will persecute. Therefore, this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets that has been shed since the beginning of the world. From the blood of Abel, that's right in the book of Genesis, to the blood of Zechariah, last book of the Old Testament, who's killed between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, this generation, speaking to the people that are in front of him, will be held responsible for it all. Jesus is saying, you're just as culpable and responsible for your ancestors and what they did and the murderous behavior they had. To which it's like, what? Jesus, we weren't there. We didn't do it. And Jesus is like, from the first book to the end, you're accountable for it all. Let me give you a word picture to help you understand what Jesus is saying here. Totally unrelated to what's happening. This is just more modern history. 80 years ago, a dictator rose to power and used words to dehumanize a group of people. His name, Hitler. And the people he dehumanized, the Jews. And with his words, he called them rats. And the language that followed, well, what do rats need to be? They need to be exterminated. What was the formula? Name them, dehumanize them, mistreat them, repeat. Before and since, world history shows us the power of this technique. You see it in Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis. What are they? They're cockroaches, so we stomp them out. We look back, what a horrible genocide. Same formula. Name them, dehumanize them, mistreat them, kill them. Ukraine right now, 3 weeks ago, Ukrainians were called Nazis. It was said they needed to be denazified, and then the war began and thousands of innocent people are being killed. Same formula. Name them, dehumanize them, mistreat them, and then kill them. It's easy to look back in hindsight with 2020 and decry atrocities of the past or even on the other side of the ocean. And let me just pick on the guys for a second just to make a point. Sorry, men. How many of you have ever called or stood by as a woman in your class or office was called the B word and then mistreated and then verbally behind her back or to her face spoken about negatively or mistreated or even worse? It's the same formula. Name them, dehumanize them, mistreat them. It would be appropriate to say the same seed that we see in all the atrocities of world history is alive and well in those behaviors we see in the modern context. To which you might say, okay, touche, but I didn't kill anyone. You're right. The outside of your cup looks a little bit better, but the inside is the same seed. The same heart. In the same way, Jesus is speaking to these religious leaders who look back on their ancestors and say, how could they be so dumb to kill the prophets? And he sees the religious leaders perpetuating the same attitudes towards himself. He was a prophet that their ancestors murderously had towards other prophets. And Jesus is saying, that seed is alive and well in you, and you're just like them, and you're just as guilty. As Jesus people, we don't look at atrocities in the world on the news and in religious circles and look at it simply with scorn without asking the question, where does that reside in me? Where am I guilty? Where do I have the seeds of that alive and active in my life that I'm covering up, even if we've never done it? Because Jesus people don't settle for looking good. We want our entire life, including our interior life, to be congruent and transformed by Jesus. It's the reason, if I'm honest, why the last few weeks personally for me, seeing all the news of this pastor having abused power and sexually abused young women and then hiding it for over a decade, when I look on that and reflect on that gut level, honestly, I see the seeds in my life To which, let me just pause. I'm not having an affair. I'm not thinking about having an affair. I love my wife. She's my best friend. But I see the seeds of it, if I'm honest. I, like him, want to hide my flaws. I want to fight for self-preservation and point to other people and bring down the behaviors of my own life. Just the other day, we dropped the kids off at the grandparents. We get home, my wife's like, oh, you forgot to give them their jackets. And immediately, right? It's like, oh, yeah, didn't put them in, didn't transfer them over. Immediately, it's like, no, I think you took them out of the car. It was right. It's just like, all of a sudden, it's a jacket. And I'm fighting for self-preservation. Like, no, clearly you did it, or I think you did it. It's just like, it's like all of a sudden, it's like, I don't want my flaws exposed. I don't want my mistakes brought into the light. And this is a jacket. I see the same seeds, the seeds of wanting to look good on the outside while hiding what's going on, what was really going on. Deflect and blame and downplay and self-preserve. I didn't cheat on my wife, but I still want to put on a front that makes my outside look better than my inside. Here's the bottom line. Jesus followers always look for the seeds of truth present in our own lives. I'm going to fast forward for the sake of time, but let me just tell you how the story ends. I'm going to invite our youth to come back for communion. You can pick up a few verses between here and the end later today, but the end of the story ends like this. The religious leaders don't say, oh, Jesus, you've convicted us. No more woes. That's enough for today. They double down and they look for ways to attack Jesus some more. They miss it. Friends, if we walk away from today, if we walk away from this passage, if we walk away from these woes that Jesus has for every Jesus follower, if we walk away thinking, gosh, I really hope so-and-so was listening to that message, we are no different than the religious hypocrites. We need to walk away from this challenged, maybe a little bit offended, and aware that we need change because we compartmentalize our lives as well. Jesus invites us to live whole lives, not compartmentalized. The bad news is that there's really no way to enforce this and guarantee this. For thousands of years, people in power and people not in power have been able to clean the outside of the cup and make everything look good and never actually reveal and never deal with the death that resides inside. That's the bad, there's no systematic way. There's no way to guarantee, and we can just guarantee every person in our church is as clean on the outside as they are on the inside. They've gone through transformation. They've allowed Jesus to reach every part of them. They're not compartmentalized at all. There's no way to guarantee that. That's incredibly depressing for me. The good news is every single one of us personally has a choice. Personally can decide not to live compartmentalized. Personally can invite Jesus to start to look inside of us and to transform us from the inside out. Compartmentalization is not a religious people problem, it's a human problem, one that Jesus came to solve, came to make us new, make us alive. It begins by inviting Jesus into our lives and then continually allowing him, allowing the Spirit of God to continue to point to things, to shave things off, to make us new from the inside out. This is why at Lakeside, we've made it one of our goals that whenever we gather, we are working hard to create space for reflection and interior examination and introspection. And that's why every month we participate in a meal of celebration, but a meal also of introspection, where we are invited to examine ourselves. It's so easy to take a meal and not think of the implications for our entire life. And so for those of you downtown, you're gonna turn off the feed now, and Johanna's gonna come up and lead us in that meal. And if you're here, Robin is gonna come up and lead us in that same meal.